There is a photograph the Chicago papers ran for 9 straight days, an old man in a camel coat being walked down the steps of his own foundation. Gala with his wrists behind him and behind him. At the top of the stairs, a big woman in green, standing perfectly still, with a champagne flute she is not drunk from. Everyone assumes she was a guest who had wandered into the shot. Cesare Bruno knew exactly who she was because 40 minutes earlier she had leaned down to his ear in a room full of donors and refilled his glass and said in the pleasant, weightless voice of a woman nobody has ever bothered to look at, "You didn't recognize me the first 4 times I poured for you either." He asked her, later, through a lawyer, what she wanted. She sent back 3 words. The mill certificates. 9 months before that, she was making $19 an hour and hiding a hole in her shoe. The Thorne Hospitality Group ran the sort of events that got written up in glossy quarterlies, and Nora Bennett had worked 400 of them without a single person learning her name. That was not an exaggeration she used for effect. It was a fact she had tested. In February, she had worked a retirement dinner where she poured for the same man 11 times, and he called her sweetheart, miss, hey, and you. 4 different words, none of them hers. She was 32. She wore a size 22 in a uniform cut for a size 6, which meant she paid a tailor out of pocket every year to let out the seams of a jacket the company would not replace. Her feet had gone bad 2 winters ago and never really come back. She worked doubles Thursday through Sunday, and on Mondays she drove her mother to dialysis in a car with a heater that only worked at speed, and on Tuesdays her daughter had reading club, and on Wednesdays she slept. Lily was 6. Lily had her grandfather's chin and a gap where 2 teeth used to be, and an unshakable conviction that her mother was the strongest person in Chicago, which was funny, because Nora had spent the last decade being told the opposite in 100 quiet ways. Margaret Bennett needed a transplant she was not going to get, and dialysis she could barely reach. Nora's rent was 8 days past due, and underneath all of it, always, sat the debt. The one her father had died inside of. The one that had followed the family like a smell. Thomas Bennett had built things, not skyscrapers, the honest middle of the trade. Parking structures, warehouse retrofits, a rehab center in Bridgeport that still had his name on the cornerstone. He had a 19-man crew, a clean safety record, and a rule he repeated so often that Nora used to mouth it along with him: the steel doesn't lie, so don't ask it to. In 2012, on a mixed-use job on the near west side, a shoring tower came down in the 8th week of the pour. 3 men died. Ruben Ortega, 44. Danny Okonkwo, 29. Peter Illich, 51. Nora knew all 3 names the way you know a prayer. The investigation found undersized steel in the shoring frames. Grade 50 specified, grade 36 delivered mill certificates in the job file saying grade 50 in a font nobody looked at twice. The supplier was a Bruno company. The inspector who had signed the pre-pour walkthrough worked under a woman named Eleanor Prescott at the city, and the man whose signature sat at the bottom of the material acceptance was Thomas Bennett, because Thomas Bennett signed everything himself, because he was the sort of man who thought that was integrity. He went away for 4 years. He died in the second one, in an infirmary, of something that started as a cough. Nora had been 19 and pregnant with a child whose father would leave in the 8th month. She'd done the only thing available to her, which was to stay upright. She kept 1 box out of the wreckage. Job files, purchase orders, change orders in her own teenage handwriting, because she had done her father's material takeoffs at the kitchen table for 3 summers and could still, at 32, read a mill certificate faster than most engineers. Nobody ever asked her to. That was the shape of her whole life. She held a rare and specific competence, and the world had decided, on sight, that she was a woman who carried trays. The Bruno Alliance Party was on the 16th of January at the Elwood on Michigan Avenue, and Thorne Hospitality had it staffed at 42. Gerald Thorne gathered them in the service corridor at 4 in the afternoon and gave the speech he always gave, which was mostly about invisibility. Move on the wall side. Never cross a conversation. If a guest looks at you, you have already made a mistake. Then he came down the line adjusting collars and stopped in front of Nora. Bennett. Floor or back? Floor, I hope. Back is. Back. He didn't look up from his tablet. Dish pit and runner. I want the champagne line cleaned tonight, and there's press coming. Grace Molina, 2 people down, said, "She's got 9 years on this room, Gerald, and a uniform that doesn't close, which the Tribune will photograph." He said it in the voice of a reasonable man making a logistics call, which is the voice that does the most damage. "It isn't personal, Bennett. It's staging," Nora said. Understood and went to the back and stood over a machine for 2 hours in 104 degrees of steam and did not let one single thing show on her face, because she had a 6-year-old and a mother on a machine, and no leverage in the world. At 8:40, a runner rolled an ankle on the ramp, and there were no bodies left, and Gerald Dorn came into the dish pit and said, "Trey, go." And Nora dried her hands and walked out onto the floor of the Elwood Ballroom carrying 11 glasses of champagne on a silver oval. She had never seen a room like it. 250 people under a ceiling 40 feet up, sleet ticking against tall black windows, and a cold coming off the lake that got in through the stone, no matter what the building did about it. The Vitali side and the Brunos side, and everyone who did business with either, all in one room, and a temperature under the music that she recognized from 20 years of listening to men in her father's kitchen. It was the feeling of a truce being priced. And at the center of it, the 2 families were announcing an arrangement, Damiano Vitale and Camilla Ashford. Nora had heard of him the way everyone had. There was a version of him that lived in the way people lowered their voices. The boss of the North Side, 39. A man whose predecessors had been loud and who was not. What she had not expected was how still he stood. Everyone else in that room was performing, being at a party. He stood by a window with a glass he never lifted, watching the door and the stairs and the service entrance in a slow rotation. And Nora, who had spent 9 years reading rooms from the wall side, understood immediately that he was the only other person present who was working. Camilla Ashford found her 40 minutes later. Nora had been circling the north end with a fresh tray. Camilla came out of a knot of women in a column of pale silver, thin as a drawn wire, with the particular radiance of someone who has just been told she is about to become important. She stopped Nora with 2 fingers on the tray's edge. "Don't move, I need one." She took a glass. She did not drink it. She looked Nora up and down with frank, unhurried interest, the way you'd examine a piece of furniture you'd been asked a price. "God. They put you on the floor?" "Yes, ma'am." "In that?" She laughed and turned her head to include the 2 women behind her, so that it would be a shared thing and not a cruelty. "Sweetheart, I'm not being unkind, but we spent $9,000 on the flowers. There's a visual language. You're a small circling gesture at Nora's whole body, wrist loose, dismissive. A lot of interruption. One of the women made a noise like a laugh that had tried not to be. "I'll speak to Thorne," Camilla said. "Don't look like that. Somebody should have told you years ago, and everyone's been too polite, and that's not kindness either." She set her untouched glass back on the tray at the far edge, deliberately, at the point where the balance breaks. Nora felt it go. 9 years of muscle memory tried to save it and could not, because the woman had put it exactly where it could not be saved. 3 glasses went off the back of the oval and hit the marble, and the sound cut the room in half. 200 people turned, and Nora Bennett stood in the middle of the Elwood Ballroom in a jacket that did not close, with champagne soaking through her shoe, and got down on one knee to pick up the glass with her bare hands, because the dustpan was 90 feet away in the service corridor, and she could not stand there being looked at for 1 second longer than she had to. "Careful," Camilla said warmly to the room. "It's slippery." That was the moment she would come back to for the rest of her life. Not the humiliation. She had years of that. It was a coat she owned in several sizes. It was what happened after. Because a hand came into her field of vision. A man's hand, a hard hand, with an old white seam across 2 knuckles, and it did not offer to help her up. It closed around her wrist and moved it away from the broken glass, firmly, the way you'd move a child's hand off a hot pan. Damiano Vitale had crossed 40 feet of ballroom without anyone seeing him start. He crouched down beside her, on the marble, in a suit that cost more than her car and her mother's chair together, and picked up 2 pieces of glass himself and set them on the tray. Then he stood and drew her up with him and did not let go of her wrist. The room had gone so quiet that Nora could hear the sleet. "Whose glass?" he said. Camilla's smile stayed on. "Damiano, don't be absurd, I watched you place it." He said it at conversational volume. That was the thing about him she would never get used to. He never raised his voice, and the effect was that everyone else's felt shrill. 9 inches out from the rim. You've done it before. You have practice. It was an accident, then you're clumsy, and I'm marrying a clumsy woman. Or it wasn't, and I'm not marrying you at all. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. Which is it? Cesare Bruno had begun to move through the crowd, unhurried. An old man with a fringe of white hair and a face like a kind pharmacist's. "Damiano," he said, "it's a party." "It is. So, let it be one." And Nora, standing there with a stranger's hand around her wrist and her knee wet and 200 people staring, understood 2 things in the same second. The first was that Damiano Vitale was looking for a door out of this engagement and had been all night. The second was that she was standing in it. He turned to her. Up close his eyes were a flat gray-brown, and there was nothing warm in them at all, and he asked her a question in a voice pitched for exactly one person. "What's your name?" "Nora Bennett." Something happened behind his face. It was small and fast, and she did not understand it for another 3 weeks. Then he said, "Nora, in about 4 seconds, I'm going to do something that will change your life, and I want you to know that you can pull your hand away, and I will let you, and you'll go home tonight and nothing will follow you. Do you understand?" Her mother had $411 of dialysis transport she couldn't cover. Her daughter had asked in November why they didn't have a tree. "Do it," Nora said. He took the ring off his own little finger. A heavy old thing, a dark stone in gold, worn shallow at one edge from decades of somebody's hand. And he put it on her. Then he turned around and told 250 people that the Vitale family thanked the Ashfords for their friendship, that there would be no arrangement, and that he intended to marry the woman standing beside him. Nobody applauded. Nobody breathed. Somewhere behind her, a chair leg dragged, and Cesare Bruno smiled the whole time, which is how she learned what he looked like when he had decided to kill someone. The terms were negotiated at 2 in the morning in a room above a shuttered pharmacy on Grand, with Enzo Marchetti standing at the door and Salvatore Conti sitting across from her with a legal pad, looking as though he had been asked to bless a house fire. 90 days, Damiano said, publicly engaged. You attend what I tell you to attend. At the end of it, we announce it didn't work, and you walk away. And what do I get? Whatever you ask for. Salvatore Conti said something in Italian, low, and Damiano answered without looking at him, and the old man subsided but did not stop watching her. Nora had thought about this in the car. She had thought about it very carefully, because she had learned early that when someone finally hands you a pen, the only unforgivable thing is to write down too small a number. My mother's on dialysis 3 days a week, and there's a transplant list she'll never come off. I want her on a private program permanently, whatever it costs, in writing, and it doesn't end when the 90 days do. She kept her hands flat on the table. I want my daughter in a school with a fence and someone at the door. Not forever, until I can pay for it myself. Done. I'm not finished. Enzo, by the door, shifted his weight. In 2012, a shoring tower came down on Ashland and killed Ruben Ortega, Danny Okonkwo, and Pedar Ilish. The steel was under spec. The mill's certificates in the job file were forged. The supplier was Lakeshore Fabrication, which is a Bruno company, and the city inspector who cleared the pre-pour reported to Eleanor Prescott. And the man who went to prison for it was my father. She said all of it without her voice moving. He died there. I was 19. I have his files in a box under my bed, and I have read them so many times I could recite the purchase orders, and I have known for 14 years exactly who did it and had no way on God's earth to make it matter. The room was very quiet. You're marrying me for 90 days, Nora said. For 90 days, I'll be standing inside the only house in Chicago that isn't afraid of Cesare Bruno. That's what I want. Not money. Access. Salvatore Conti took his glasses off. Damiano Vitali leaned back in his chair and looked at her for a long, long moment, and when he spoke his voice had changed in a way she couldn't name. Illich, he said. Petar Illich had a daughter who works in my accounts office. She was 14 when it happened. He turned the glass on the table a quarter turn. I have wanted the man who did that for 14 years. And I've never been able to put a hand on the paper. I can read the paper. I'm beginning to see that. Enzo Marchetti, from the door, said the first words he had spoken all night. Sir, it's the same fight. Yes, Damiano said. It is. The stylist came on a Thursday and lasted 9 minutes. Fabienne Cross had a rolling rack, a silver mane, and the manner of a man who had built a career on telling women what to be ashamed of. He circled her twice, hummed, and produced something charcoal and shapeless. A soft column. We blur the middle, we draw the eye to the face, and everything else simply recedes. Very discreet. Very forgiving. Forgiving, Nora repeated. That's the job of the garment, darling. No, Damiano said from the hallway. He had a way of arriving that skipped the part where you heard him coming. She's not going to a hearing. She's the reason people will look at the room at all. Mr. Gendi, Vitale with respect. At this size, the professional guidance is always to minimize. Then the professional can leave. Nothing in his tone changed at all. Take the rack. Send an invoice. Don't send yourself. The gown that arrived on Saturday was oxblood. Deep and dark and heavy silk that read almost black until the light broke on it, cut close through the body and apologizing for nothing, with sleeves and a neckline and a hem that all admitted plainly that a woman was inside them. Garnets at the ears. Nothing at the throat. Grace Molina came to help her dress and had to sit down on the edge of the bath. 9 years, Grace said. 9 years I've watched you come in at 4 and leave at 2, and this is the first time I've ever seen you stand up straight. I always stand up straight. You stand up quiet. There's a difference. Ugh. When Nora came down, Vince Ricci, a slab of a man who had not yet offered her a whole sentence, took off his hat, which she later learned he had not done in a private house since his mother's funeral. Damiano looked at her from the bottom of the stairs and said nothing at all for a while. Then, everyone in that room tonight has been told a story about you. Poor girl. Lucky girl. Rescued. He held out his arm. Go and ruin it. The first strike came out of a filing cabinet. It was Nora's idea, and it arrived at 4 in the morning, sitting on a kitchen floor with her father's box open around her and her feet aching from a life she technically no longer had to live. She called Enzo at 6. Thorn Hospitality keeps event manifests for 9 years, she told the table that night. Every private booking, room, date, head count, floor plan, and a service list, where every chair went and who sat in it, because that's how you know who gets the shellfish and who gets the kosher plate. Gerald Thorne staffed every private dinner Cesare Bruno ever held in this city. Everyone. Because Thorne's the only house in Chicago with a non-disclosure that actually holds. Salvatore Conti said, so he has a guest list. He has 14 years of them. And on the 19th of March, 2012, 11 days before the pour on Ashland, there's a private dinner at the Grange Field for 9 covers. I worked it. I was 20. I carried the bread. Nora put her hand flat on the table. I remember it because I got written up that night for taking too long clearing, and the reason I took too long is that the room went quiet every time I came in, and it kept happening, and I couldn't figure out the rhythm. Damiano's eyes had not left her face. 9 covers, she said. Cesare Bruno, 2 men from Lakeshore Fabrication, a city man whose name I never got, Eleanor Prescott's deputy, and Renzo Fontana. The temperature of the room changed. Renzo does business with everybody, Salvatore said carefully. That's what an underboss does. It is, Nora agreed. But 11 days before 3 men died under Bruno's steel, he was sitting at a 9 top with the people who supplied it, and the room stopped talking every time the fat girl came in with the bread. Damiano stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sleet for a long time. "Enzo," he said, "get me the manifests." Getting the manifests required Gerald Thorne, and getting Gerald Thorne required almost nothing at all, which was the most satisfying discovery of Nora's life. He came to the house in Kenilworth because Enzo asked him to, and he came smiling because he had spent 6 weeks telling everyone he knew that the Vitale fiancée had been his girl. And he sat in a room with 3 men and a woman he had banished to a dish pit, and slowly understood that the woman was the one asking questions. "The 19th of March, 2012, Nora said. The Grangefield. 9 covers. Bennett, Nora. I don't keep those in my head. You keep them in a records room in Cicero, in bankers' boxes, in year order, because you told a Cranes reporter so in 2018. She slid the printout across. You said it made your clients feel safe. Thorne's face did an ugly thing. Those are confidential. 3 men died. That's not I know it isn't." And here she leaned in, because she had waited 9 years to be on this side of a table from Gerald Thorne. "That's what makes this easy for you. You didn't kill anybody. You catered. Give me the boxes, and you're a man who cooperated. Don't, and I'll tell every family in the city that you keep a 14-year record of who sat next to whom." She sat back. "How long do you think that business lasts once everyone knows it exists?" He gave up the boxes in 4 days. What was in them broke the case open, and it broke it open in a way that hurt. The manifests confirmed the 9 top. They also documented 11 other private dinners across 4 years, at which Renzo Fontana had been present with Bruno men, none of which appeared anywhere in the Vitale family's own records. And a service note in a captain's handwriting from a dinner in 2015, guest in seat 4. Requests no staff in room during dessert, same as prior. Damiano read it standing up. Then he read it again. 26 years, he said. Salvatore Conti had gone gray. "It's circumstantial, Damiano. It's seating charts. Sal, he was godfather to my brother's child. That's why it has to be more than seating charts." And it was Nora. Of course it was Nora who said, "Then let's use the part of the paper that can't argue." Because the mill certificates were still out there. Forged documents live in 3 places: the job file, the supplier's file, and the mill's own archive. 2 of those had been buried. The third belonged to a steel mill in northern Indiana that had been sold twice since 2012, and whose records had gone to a document storage vendor in Hammond, and nobody, not the state, not the defense, not one investigator in 14 years had gone and pulled the mill's own copies because everybody already knew who had signed. Enzo went to Hammond with a lawyer and a court order and came back with 11 pages. Grade 36. Every heat number. Every one, matching the certificates in her father's file except for 1 digit, retyped in a font that had not existed in the mill's system until 2 months after the shipment. Nora sat with the pages on the kitchen table for a very long time. Lily came in and put her chin on her mother's shoulder and asked what she was reading. "A receipt," Nora said. "For what?" "For your grandfather," she said, and could not say anything else for a while. The retaliation came on a Tuesday, at the Palmer Row Hotel, during a walkthrough for a charity dinner. Nora was there because Damiano was there, and Damiano was there because a Bruno-adjacent developer had asked for a meeting on neutral ground. And Salvatore Conti had said it was too clean and too easy, and had been overruled by a man who had spent 6 weeks getting angrier than he was letting on. At 4:15, Nora went down to the service level to look at the kitchen, because 9 years of habit will outlive a fiancé's ring, and because the floor plan had bothered her since she'd seen it. She had worked the Palmer Row 9 times. She knew that the freight corridor dog-legged twice. She knew that the ballroom's east service door opened into a blind ramp with a 14-foot drop-off to the loading bay. And she knew the room was stuffed at 11 people on a walk-through day. Which is why the man standing at the far end of the corridor in a Palmer Row uniform was a problem, because he was carrying a full bus tub with one hand at chest height, and nobody who has ever actually carried a bus tub carries it like that. He had a healing burn along the web of his right hand, Nora Bennett had 2 seconds, and she did not spend either of them being afraid. She hit the fire alarm pole with her elbow, which does not sound like much, except that in a hotel kitchen, the alarm drops the makeup air, and the pressure differential slams the corridor doors on their magnets, and the fire curtain comes down over the ballroom's east service opening, which was where Damiano Vitale was walking at that exact moment. The man dropped the tub. What was under the towel was not a plate. He came down the corridor fast, and Nora, who had shoved 10,000 banquet carts down that exact ramp, who knew to the inch where the floor pitched, put her whole 190 pounds behind a loaded 6-foot cart and let the grade do the rest. It took him at the knee, going 11 miles an hour. He went into the wall. The gun went across the tile and under the dish machine. He got up. She had not expected him to get up, so Nora reached over her head and pulled the manual release on the hood's suppression system, and 30 gallons of wet chemical came down out of the range hood onto both of them and the gas cut. And the man called Kane went down, clawing at his eyes in a corridor filling with alkaline foam, and Nora Bennett, soaked blind in one eye, with her ears ringing from the alarm, sat on his back and put a banquet strap around his wrists and pulled it with both hands the way you cinch a sheet pan for transport. Damiano came through the fire curtain 9 seconds later with vents behind him and found his fiancée sitting on an assassin in a lake of foam. He did not speak. He crossed the corridor and got his hands under her arms and lifted her off the man and turned her face to the light, checking her, both hands, breathing badly. "I'm all right. You are not." "I am." "He's not." She pushed his wrists down. "He's got a burn on his right hand from an ejection port. Don't let anyone move him until Enzo photographs it, because that's the same hand that was in the alley on the Ashland job the night the tower came down, and there's a witness statement that mentions it." Damiano stared at her. "You remembered a witness statement," he said, "while you were doing that. I've been reading that box since I was 19. And then, because there is only so much a person can hold, she started shaking, and Damiano Vitale, who had opened a man's throat in a parking structure in Cicero at 24 and never once lost sleep, sat down on the wet tile of a hotel service corridor in a $4,000 suit and pulled her into him and held the back of her head with one hand and said absolutely nothing for 4 minutes. When she finally looked up, he kissed her. It was not gentle, and it was not careful. It was the kiss of a man who had just done arithmetic on how close he had come to losing something, and had not liked the answer, and it had teeth in it, and Nora fisted both hands in his ruined shirt and gave it back. 90 days, she said, when they came apart. Yes, that was a stupid number. It was, Damiano agreed. The only one I thought you'd accept. Kane talked, because Kane was a contractor and had never in his life been paid enough to be loyal. He had been hired twice, once in 2012, to be present on Ashland the night before the pour in case anyone came looking at the shoring towers. Once 9 days ago for the Palmer Row. Both times through the same broker. Both times the money moved through a construction locals benefit fund. Renzo Fontana had been the trustee of that fund since 2009. The sit-down happened on a Sunday at the Wentworth Club, under the old protocol. 5 families, no soldiers past the coat room, an old man in the chair to keep order. Salvatore Conti made the arrangements himself, and he made them slowly and correctly, because he had spent 3 weeks praying he was wrong and had run out of ways to be. They sat Renzo at Damiano's right hand, because that is where he had sat for 26 years. Nora came in last in the green, deep forest heavy because oxblood was for parties, and this was not one. And she carried a document folder instead of a tray, and she watched Cesare Bruno's face when he registered that the woman walking to the head of the table was the one who had refilled his glass at 11 parties over 9 years. "You'll forgive me," Cesare said pleasantly. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "We have. You've just never had to remember it." She laid it out in 11 minutes, standing, without notes, in the flat, clear voice of a woman who has explained a floor plan to 900 waiters. The Ashland specification, the Lakeshore delivery, the Mill Zone archive against the job file, Heat number by heat number, one digit different, a font that didn't exist yet. The 9 top at the Grangefield 11 days before the pour. 11 undisclosed dinners, a benefit fund with one trustee. A contractor named Kane, paid twice, 14 years apart, out of the same account. And a burn on a right hand that appeared in a Chicago police witness statement from 2012 that no one had ever bothered to match to anything, because the case was closed the day they found Thomas Bennett's signature. When she finished, nobody moved. Salvatore Conti passed the folder to the man in the chair, who read for a long time with his glasses low on his nose. "Renzo," Damiano said, and his voice was so ordinary that 2 men flinched. 26 years. You held my brother's daughter at her christening. Tell me it's wrong." Renzo Fontana looked at the table. "I want to hear you say it's wrong." Damiano. "Say it's wrong, Renzo." He didn't. What happened to Renzo Fontana happened elsewhere, and Nora did not ask about it, and she has never once claimed she didn't know. What happened to Cesare Bruno was slower, and she designed it that way. He had wanted to be a man of standing. He had spent 30 years buying his way onto boards, and there was a foundation with his name on the wing of a hospital. And every February he stood at the top of the stairs at his own gala and shook 200 hands. Nora let him have the gala. The mill's certificates went to the U.S. Attorney's office in November, along with the fund records, along with Kane, who by then had a lawyer and a deal. Eleanor Prescott resigned in December and was indicted in March. And the deputy who cleared the pre-pour walkthrough in 2012 gave 4 days of testimony in exchange for his pension. Lakeshore Fabrication was gone by spring, and on a Saturday in February at the top of a marble staircase in the 9th minute of his own reception, federal agents took Cesare Bruno's elbows on either side and walked him down past the photographers in a camel coat somebody had draped over his hands. Nora stood at the top of the stairs holding a glass she did not drink from because she had wanted him to see on the way down exactly the same picture he had ignored for 9 years, a woman on the wall side with a tray. Thomas Bennett's conviction was vacated on the 9th of June. It took a judge 11 minutes to say it and 14 years to get there. Ruben Ortega's widow got a settlement. Danny Okonkwo's mother got one, and she wrote Nora a letter that Nora has never been able to read all the way through in one sitting. Peter Illick's daughter, the one from the accounts office, came to the wedding and sat in the second row and cried through all of it. Gerald Thorne testified, kept his company, and lost every client who had ever asked for privacy. Preston Wilder, who had left a 19-year-old pregnant girl in a rented apartment in Pilsen and gone on to marry a woman with a house in Winnetka, wrote to Nora 4 times in the spring about Lily, about his rights, about, eventually, an investment opportunity. The 4th letter was answered by a lawyer in a single paragraph, and there was not a 5th. Camilla Ashford's family divested from 3 Bruno-adjacent holdings in a weekend, and her name stopped appearing in the quarterlies, and that, in her world, is the same as being walked down a staircase. The wedding was in September, in a garden in Lake Forest, with 111 people, and no press and a security arrangement. Enzo Marchetti described as adequate in a tone that meant otherwise. Margaret Bennett walked in on her own feet, 9 weeks post-transplant, furious about the wheelchair she'd been offered, holding her daughter's arm like a woman escorting a queen. Lily carried the rings and dropped one and found it and announced the fact to everyone. Salvatore Conti gave the blessing. He had opposed the marriage in January publicly and on the record, and he said so from the front. And then he said that he had been a lawyer for 51 years and had never watched anyone build a case the way that woman had built one out of seating charts and steel receipts, and that if the family had any sense it would stop asking whether she belonged in the room and start asking her what she thought. Vince Ricci cried. Enzo gave a toast 3 sentences long that put 4 men's hands over their eyes. And late, when the lights were down and the caterers were breaking the room, Grace Molina among them, because Nora had hired her friend's whole crew at 4 times the going rate and told them to leave the flowers standing. Damiano found her sitting on a stone step with her shoes off, watching people she used to be work a floor she used to work. They keep calling you the boss's wife, he said. Let them. Sale doesn't. Sale calls you the one who reads. He sat down beside her, on a step meant for one person, which is how they had done everything since a broken glass on a marble floor. There's a story the city's telling. Server marries a dangerous man, gets lifted out of her life. It's a good story. It's a lie. He turned her hand over and looked at the ring. The old one, worn shallow at the edge. You knew who killed your father when you were 19. You carried it for 14 years while people looked straight through you. All I did was open a door you'd already picked the lock on. Across the lawn, someone dropped a rack of glasses. The whole party turned to look. Nora didn't. That's the part nobody understands, she said. I was never invisible. I was unwatched. Those aren't the same thing at all. She leaned into his shoulder. One of them, you can survive. The other one, if you patient, you can use. They looked at Nora Bennett for 9 years and saw a tray and a uniform and a body they had opinions about, and not one of them ever considered that a woman standing quietly against a wall might be the only person in the building who was listening. That was not an accident of hers. It was a decision of theirs, and it cost them a supplier, a foundation, a family, and an old man's name carved off the side of a hospital. If this one got under your skin, hit that like button for Nora. Share it with someone who spent too long being talked past, and subscribe, because there's another woman being underestimated somewhere, and I've got her story next. And tell me down in the comments, when Camilla set that glass on the edge of the tray, what would you have done?